Welcome, everyone. We are going to get started here in just a minute. Thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you, everyone. We're going to get started here in just a minute. So just hang tight and thank you for joining us. All right, it is 7 o'clock, so I am going to get us started. So thank you so much for joining us. This is going to be an excellent webinar about the state of Iowa's water with Iowa's very own water quality expert, Chris Jones. We're really happy to have you with us, and we thank you for your work and for everything that you have done with your blog and with the articles that you write. You're a leading voice on water quality issues, and we really look to your example on some of this technical stuff that I think is important that we all know a little bit more about. So thank you, Chris. And we'll allow him to speak here in just a little bit. I'm going to go through a quick few housekeeping things. So at the end of the webinar, after Chris is done talking, we're going to have Q&A. So if you have any questions, please put those into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can also put them in the chat. It's a little bit harder for us to monitor that, but feel free to use that. We'll try to keep an eye on the chat as well. And one of the things that we are really passionate about right now at the Sierra Club is water quality, and specifically how agriculture impacts water quality. We know that in Iowa we have a water crisis. Every 2 years the DNR puts out an impaired waters report, and that report tells us that we have a water crisis in Iowa. In the most recent report that they put out just in December of 2020, it shows that Iowa has 586 impaired waters with 730 impairments. So we know some rivers go from, one part of the state all the way across to the other. So they split those up into segments. That's how we get more impairments than impaired water bodies. But I think the more important thing to understand is that of what they're testing, 61% of rivers and streams in Iowa are Category 5 impairment. 67% of lakes and reservoirs that they test in Iowa are Category 5 impairment, and wetlands, 23% are impaired. So this is, just a sign that we are not taking care of our water and we're not taking care of our land. And that's why we've brought expert Chris Jones here. He is with the University of Iowa, and he's going to tell us a little bit about how we got into this mess and how do we get out of it, and what are the implications if we don't do something to clean up our water. So Chris, thank you so much for joining us, and I will hand this over to you, and we'd love to hear your presentation.
Okay, very good. So are you seeing it?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay. So yes, my name is Chris Jones. I'm a research engineer with IIHR, Hydroscience and Engineering at the University of Iowa. And so if you know Iowa City, IIHR is housed within this building here, the Stanley building right on the banks of the Iowa River, right there. And IIHR, the Institute has actually been at the university for exactly 100 years. And so there's about 50 faculty and PhD scientists that work out of the Institute, and there's a little over 100 graduate students, and the graduate students come from all over the world, every place you can imagine. And so over the years, the research that's been done there has been primarily on hydraulics and things like ship design for the Navy, and more recently flooding. And then in 2012, with the introduction of the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy, some of that money comes over to the university, and that funds the Water Quality Sensor Network, which is what I manage. And so since that time, the Institute's been involved in water quality issues here in Iowa, in addition to the flooding. So many of you maybe have heard of the Iowa Flood Center. And not many people have heard of IIHR, but the Iowa Flood Center is actually part of IIHR. And so my title is a research engineer. I am not an engineer by training. I'm actually an analytical chemist by training, but that's what they call me. And so if you've never been to my website, I invite you to go there, and I post all my slides from all my presentations. I don't have tonight's slides up there yet, but I will in the next few days. And yes, I do write blog posts, and you can read those if you're interested in my thoughts about water quality and agriculture and some other things here in Iowa. And so I try to post on there about every couple of weeks, but I went the whole month of January without writing anything, and so I haven't put anything up there in a while. As I said, the proximate reason for my job is to manage the university's network of water quality sensors. And so these are deployed in streams around the state of Iowa at about 70 locations. And this is what one of the locations looks like. We have a field staff that work full-time managing the system. And so I supervise those guys and try to run a little research program using the data that we generate. These are the sites. As you can see, the blue sites are funded through the nutrient strategy. You can see there, and it's what I call IIHR sites. We also have a website where we harvest data from USGS. And so those are the green sites. And then the red sites are funded through the Iowa Watershed Approach Project, which is a project with the funding from the Housing and Urban Development that pays for about 10 sites around the state of Iowa. And so we're measuring nitrate, nitrogen at just about all of them. And then at a subset of sites, we also measure the parameters you see there: temperature, pH, conductivity, dissolved oxygen, and turbidity. This is one of the sites on the Wapsipinicon River near DeWitt, Iowa, in eastern Iowa. You can see on the left, the sensors slide down through that PVC pipe into the moving river water. Then up on the bank, we have a dry box with a solar panel. And in the dry box, we have a deep cycle battery, a modem, and a data logger, and some other things to transmit the data back to the university here. And so we get a package of data that comes in every 15 minutes from every site. And so as you can imagine, we're amassing quite a large amount of data. And so here's another picture of a site. This is actually on a constructed wetland in northeast Iowa near the town of Osage, Iowa, the inlet and the outlet. And so this is the website that displays the data, and it's called the Iowa Water Quality Information System. It's really quite a tool, and I would invite you to take a look at that. There's lots of things you can do there. You'll see a map like this, and it shows the sites where the sensors are deployed. And so they're color coded based on the nitrate concentration at the time. If you go to it today, you won't see nearly this many locations because we do have to pull many of the sensors in the wintertime to prevent ice damage. And so a lot of stuff you can do here, and I really encourage you to look at it. There's an excellent land cover tool, and so you can click on any spot in the state of Iowa, and it will delineate the upstream area draining to that spot and tell you what the land cover is in that watershed. And so, for example, this is the watershed upstream from Iowa City on the Iowa River. And as you can see there, it's 38% corn and 29% soybeans, and then these other land uses in that watershed. yes, I try to publish some original research using the data, and I work closely with Keith Schilling, who's the state geologist at the Iowa Geological Survey. And so this is just a sampling of the papers that we've published, or the paper topics that we've published over the last 5 years or so. So whenever I talk to people, I always impress upon them that it's really important. If we're going to understand Iowa water quality, we have to also understand the geological history of Iowa. And of course, that's one of glaciation. And so Iowa has actually had, we think, 7 glaciers intrude into the state, but we've had 3 main events. And the first one, or the first main event, is what we call the Pre-Illinoisan Glacier, where ice had basically extended down south to the current course of the Missouri River down in Missouri. And so this was lasted 2 million years, from 500,000 years ago to 2.5 million years ago. And then we have the Illinoisan Glacier that was mainly over the eastern Corn Belt and the Great Lakes, just barely edged into southeast Iowa. And you can see evidence of this over here at Iowa City. Iowa City itself is very hilly, but you go just south of town here and it's really flattens out. And so that's where that Illinoisan Glacier came over into the state. And then the last one we talk about the most is the Wisconsin Glacier. And so it came down into north central Iowa. And now we see evidence of that in what we call the Des Moines Lobe. And so this flat area that runs from Des Moines up to the Minnesota border, that's where the Wisconsin Glacier was. And so that was only 10,000 years ago. Ice was there. And so what we see is really recent and really new. And so glaciation has left the landforms that we see across the state. And so if you didn't know any better and you drove across the state, you would think Iowa was pretty uniform. And that's because, you know, we only have 2 species out there for the most part. But the truth is we have quite a variety of land formations in the state. And so the 4 big ones there, the Northwest Iowa Plains, the Des Moines Lobe, the Iowan Surface, and the Southern Iowa Drift Plain. Up until about 40 years ago, we thought the Iowan Surface was actually a part of the Wisconsin glaciation, but now we've figured out that it is not. It was a tundra during the Wisconsin Glacier, much like the Northwest Iowa Plains was. The difference between the Northwest Iowa Plains and the Iowan Surface is there's probably never been trees in the Northwest Iowa Plains, whereas we did have some prehistoric forests in the Iowan Surface. Then we also have the Paleozoic Plateau in far northeast Iowa, and that's where we've never really had ice up there. And so if you've been up there, which most people probably have at one time or another, you can see how hilly it is and how different it is from the rest of Iowa. And so one thing I always talk about when we talk about water quality is a lot of people don't recognize how extreme our weather is here in Iowa. And so this Des Moines Lobe area is part of the Prairie Pothole region, and this is actually the most extreme climate on Earth, this area running from Des Moines up to about Edmonton, Alberta. And so I think we all recognize that. Some years we can get 60 inches of rain. Some years we can get 10 inches of rain. We see a lot of variation, especially in our winters. And so we're having a very snowy winter this year. Obviously, other winters we can get not much. Can be, you know, as cold as Canada or as warm as St. Louis. It just depends. And so as we try to improve our water here in Iowa, this is one thing that we're always trying to cope with, is the extreme weather that we have. And so I think everybody knows prior to settlement, this is what Iowa looked like. We had the pothole wetlands there on the top. That would have been mainly on the Des Moines Lobe, but also other places, including the Iowan surface. Then we have the oak savanna there in the lower left, and the tall grass prairie in the lower right. And of course, all that stuff's mostly gone. I think we all know that. And so mainly we have crops now, and then this map shows the brown areas are where we have cropland. And so about 70% or a little bit more of our land is actually cropped. We still have a fair amount of forest in the dark green there in the river bottoms. And actually our forest may have increased some over the last century, although I've heard it might be declining again. And so we see the grassland or the pasture areas there in the light green. And so all the prairies and the wetlands, they're gone, we know. And so that's had a big effect on our water quality. And so it's also had a big effect on how our streams look. And so prior to settlement, most of our prairie streams would have been shallow and wide streams, as you see there with the perennial plants on the banks, gently sloping banks. The water table would have been very close to the surface. And so we would not have had very much surface runoff because all the surface area provided by the prairie and the perennial plants. And so we don't see many of our streams that look like this anymore. And so our fish assemblage would have been clean water species like the smallmouth bass and the pumpkin seed sunfish, and then the generalist species, channel catfish. And of course, when we got here, we started modifying the environment. And, one of the main things we did was drain it. And so especially in the northern 2/3 of Iowa, north of I-80, we see a lot of artificial drainage. And of course, we did that to lower the water table to optimize conditions for cultivation of crops. And so we made these trapezoidal ditches with the steam shovels there in the upper left and there in the upper right. That's what they look like today. And there you see a big county tile main coming into that constructed ditch. And you see the fellows there in the lower left putting in the old clay tile in Boone County 100 years ago. And of course, now we have these field tiles also that enter these constructed ditches there on the lower right. And so we've completely changed the hydrology of our streams. And this is very important as we look at water quality and what we can do to improve it. And so now many of our streams, the origin of our streams or the start of our streams look like this. And so this is a bunch of county tile mains all coming together near the town of Marathon, Iowa. And this is actually the start of the Raccoon River. And so we have lots and lots of streams that this is how they begin. They begin as tile outfalls. And so we can imagine prior to settlement, these streams began as sort of gently overflowing wetlands that, flowed into a stream bed. And so we can see there, this water, as it begins, it immediately has a 3-foot drop. And this has big implications. And so I think I'll talk about that here in a couple of slides ahead. And so where do streams begin? Of course, they begin as tiles, as I said. And so, and this has had big effects. And so not only have we drained the landscape, but we also straightened all these streams, right? And so this is Walnut Creek in Jasper County. And the green there is what the stream bed was in 1930. And so you can see we have a meandering stream. And then we straightened it. And so the red is what the stream bed looks like now. And so that green line is 1,000 meters long, where that red line is 500 meters. Well, the elevation drop between A and B is still the same, right? We haven't changed that at all, but we've shortened the distance between A and B. And so what does that mean? Well, it means the water's going a lot faster. right? And so that has big implications for a lot of things. And so the stream's going to cut downward. And so now this is what it looks like. That's not, you know, the gently sloping banks that spill out into the floodplain. We have these streams down in these canyons. So you can see that fellow there in the top with the staff gauge down at the bottom of Walnut Creek. And these two pictures are the same spot, believe it or not. And so you can see that hillside in the back. And so that water can look like that in the top slide, and 12 hours later, it can look like the photo in the bottom slide. So that's how fast our streams change. They're so flashy. And so this has all sorts of consequences for water quality and habitat and so forth. And so it'll go through this whole cycle in 24 hours after a rainstorm. You know, and of course, that was not the case prior to settlement. And so now our streams look like this. They're way down in these canyons, right? And so we've replaced the perennial plants on the banks with the annual plants, the corn and soybeans. We put in the tile drainage. We've had all this down cutting. And so now we have all this bare soil, as we saw on that previous slide. It's really vulnerable to erosion when the stream comes up. So when we had those shallow sloping banks and the prairie streams, we didn't have nearly the stream bank erosion that we have now. And so consequently, the cloudiness or the turbidity of our water was much less. So the bottoms of our streams have silted in, the water table is much deeper, and we have these steep unvegetated banks. And so now we have these pollution tolerant species like the carp and the bullhead, and we still have a few of the generalists, the channel catfish, but you know, most of our streams now can't support these clean water species like the smallmouth bass and the pumpkin seed. And so, you know, what we've done is we've really reduced the amount of time that water stays on the landscape. And so this is Bear Creek, I think, in Story County. And so that on the left there is 1847. And so you see all the streams in red. And so you can see just a very few short stream stretches. Then as we started draining everything, we took the streams up into the watershed. And so there you see 1919 where we had streams, and then finally 1972 where we had constructed all these ditches to capture the tiles. And now we have streams all over the place that weren't there prior to settlement. And so Walnut Creek again, Jasper County, we can see there in the red, that was the pre-settlement streams, and the blue is where the streams are now. And so big changes in the hydrology. And again, Walnut Creek here, we can see that we've nearly doubled the amount of stream length and density there in Walnut Creek. So the same time we were doing all this change in the hydrology, our weather's been getting a lot wetter. And so this is the increase in precipitation over the last century. These are the crop districts in Iowa. There's 9 of them. You can see how precipitation has changed and increased across the state over the last 100 years. And so, for example, the Raccoon River, we can see there as divide the precipitation data into 20-year increments. We see how it's increasing. And this graph has gotten a lot of mileage for me. This is the precipitation for the Raccoon River watershed based on 4 stations: Des Moines, Storm Lake, Rockwell City, and Guthrie Center. And when I divide the last 100 years of data into 2 50-year chunks, you can see that first 50 years, the amount of rain that watershed got exceeded 1 meter exactly one time. And so the annual precipitation exceeded 1 meter one time in the first 50 years. In the last 50 years, precipitation has exceeded 1 meter 15 times. You know, that's really quite a remarkable thing. And likewise, drought, we can see that in the first 50 years, precipitation was less than 600 millimeters 9 times, but only 2 times in the last 50 years and no times since 1980. And so we all think of 2012 as being the worst drought of our lifetimes. Actually, 2012, not even in the top 10 driest years for the Raccoon River. And so this increase in stream flow we've seen happen all over Iowa. This is at East Nishnabotna, Des Moines River at Stratford, Iowa River at Marengo. And so just about every place we look, we see this real dramatic increase in stream flow. And so this is a huge problem. And we're really not addressing this at all at the state level. You know, this is just a gigantic problem for us. And, you know, we're really not making an attempt to address it. And so we fully expect in precipitation to continue to increase. In this paper from people at Iowa State, looking at Perry, Iowa, which is close to the middle of the state, it's the Raccoon River watershed. Their models show a 24 to 32% increase in annual precipitation between now and 2050, I believe. And so an increase of about 2.5 degrees Celsius in temperature. And so we know for a certainty farmers are going to respond to this by putting in more tile and trying to drain the land more efficiently. And so all these things that have happened, it's only going to intensify. And so this has consequences for us, and we know what they are. The consequences are, we know we have these dead zone down in the Gulf of Mexico there in the lower right, from the nutrients and the flow from the Mississippi River, which of course all of Iowa flows into the Mississippi one way or another. But other places too, like Lake Erie there in the left-hand side there, a lot of similar things happening in eastern Indiana and western Ohio, where you have the old historic lake bottom, a lot of really flat there, a lot of tile, a lot of livestock, a lot of agriculture. So a lot of nutrients entering Lake Erie, the western basin of Lake Erie, especially the Maumee River. And so we see similar things happening as in the Gulf of Mexico. And so we also know this has consequences for drinking water. We know Des Moines is removing nitrate from the water, and we know Toledo, Ohio, there in the upper left, had the big algae bloom a few years ago that made their water undrinkable. And so these are all things that we're trying to cope with as a result of land use change and farming and climate change. And so I thought I'd talk a little bit about my own work here. And so I'll talk about a paper here published a few years ago where we looked at water quality data from the outlets of these 23 watersheds. You can see where they are here, and the data was Iowa DNR data collected from their ambient water monitoring network. And so we have 12 streams that flow directly to the upper Mississippi River. That's 1 through 12, and then 13 through 23 are tributaries of the Missouri River. And so I had a graduate student aggregate all that data, and then he wrote a master's thesis about it and left. And so what I did was I tried to put that into some context, and I aggregated data for the Missouri River at Hermann, Missouri, the upper Mississippi at Thebes, Illinois, and then down in Louisiana, the Mississippi River at St. Francisville, and then the Atchafalaya River at Melville, Louisiana. And so if you don't know, down there at St. Francisville, we divert about 20 to 30% of the Mississippi into the Atchafalaya to try to help protect New Orleans and maintain the present river course. And so when we look at water quality data, we have to look at both of those sites down there, Melville on the Atchafalaya and St. Francisville on the Mississippi. And so when I look at all this data, Iowa versus the rest of the larger basins, this is the graph shows the area of land draining to the Missouri River. And so this is about 31% of Iowa. And when we look at the entire Missouri River watershed, Iowa's portion of that in terms of the land is 3.3%. In terms of the water, about 12% of the water going to the Missouri River comes from Iowa, but about 55% of the nitrate in the Missouri River comes from that 3.3% of the land that's in Iowa. And so we can see that, you know, some years the Missouri River would really have almost no nitrate in it, and if it were not for Iowa. So you see there 2006, 2011, 2003, you know, about 80 to 90% of the nitrate in the Missouri River is from Iowa. And so when we look at the upper Mississippi, this is the Mississippi River above St. Louis, above the Missouri confluence, essentially. Iowa has 21% of the land. We have 21% of the water, but we contribute 45% of the nitrate. And then down at the Gulf, we have 4.5% of the land. We have contribute 5.9% of the water, and we contribute 29% of the nitrate. And so this just tells us, you know, if we're going to solve this problem down at the Gulf of Mexico, you know, we really have to focus on places like Iowa where, you know, that's the origin of the problem. And so, as we always say, if we can solve Iowa, we can solve solve everything. And so, so that's where we try to figure things out. How can we figure things out up here in the Western Corn Belt? And so when I look at that data over that period, 2003 to 2016, which is when this student ended his time, we look at the 5-year running annual average for data. And so down at the Gulf, the load, the nitrate load was increasing about 52,000 tons per year. But we look at this whole big area, the Ohio Basin and the Red River and Arkansas River basins, the nitrate load's actually decreasing about 33,000 tons per year. The Upper Miss increasing 38,000 tons per year, but Iowa area is draining to the Upper Miss, increasing 57,000 tons per year, and Iowa area is draining to the Missouri 38,000 tons per year. And so we can see that the load to the Gulf would actually be decreasing were it not for Iowa, right? And so whatever's happening in the larger basin seems to be different from what's happening in Iowa. And so when we look at these 5-year running annual averages, again, areas, this is updated now. Iowa, the nitrate load is increasing about 73%. Iowa areas draining to the Mississippi have increased about 55%. And Iowa areas draining to the Missouri really increasing pretty rapidly, 132%. And so, you know, why are things changing in Western Iowa so much more than Eastern Iowa? And a couple possibilities there are, you know, we've converted a lot of pasture to row crop out there. We've had a real intensification of hog production, especially in Northwest Iowa, are two ideas. But anyway, this all was summarized in this paper, and this is open access. Anybody can go to it and read it if they want. Iowa stream nitrate in the Gulf of Mexico in this journal +1. And so knowing what we knew from that first paper on the Missouri River, I decided to kind of see whether maybe livestock could be an issue here with this big increase in areas of Iowa draining to the Missouri. And probably a lot of you have seen this map where we show confined animal feeding operations in Iowa, where they're located. And so we don't have these evenly distributed around Iowa, right? We have some concentrated areas here, especially northwest Iowa, and these areas draining to the Little Sioux River, but also north central Iowa, Hardin and Hamilton County, and then down here south Iowa City, Washington County. And so what I did was I looked at the sensor data from our water quality sensor network from these 9 streams draining to the Missouri River. And so we got the Rock River, the Floyd, the Monona Harrison Ditch, the Little Sioux. This is the Soldier River, the Boyer River, the West Nishnabotna, the East Nishnabotna, and the Nottoway River. And so I got the nitrate data for all those watersheds for the outlets there for 2017 from the sensors. And then I also was able to aggregate fertilization data from this data source. USGS has the amount of manure and commercial nitrogen fertilizer sold and applied in every county in the United States. And so I derived the amounts for the watersheds shown in the previous slide based on the percentage of the county that lies within each of those watersheds, and derived the amount of nitrogen that's being applied in those watersheds. And then finally, I got some animal population data from DNR. And so this shows how things have changed in these watersheds over the last 40 years or so. And so we can see the hogs have greatly increased there in 2 of them, especially the Rock River and the Floyd River in the red and green of far northwest Iowa, whereas those other 7, we have not seen a big increase in the hog population. And in fact, we've seen a decline in some of them. And then I also got the cattle numbers. And again, the Floyd and the Rock River, the cattle populations greatly expanding over the last 20 years. We can see the other 7 really not changing much. And actually, Nottoway River, the cattle population declining quite dramatically. And so when I look at the nitrate concentration in those 9 watersheds, lo and behold, the Floyd and the Rock, the 2 with the highest density of livestock, also have the highest nitrate concentration, right? So these are what we call box and whisker plots. And so the line within the box is the mean, and then the 25 to 75 percentile is within the box, and then outside of the box are the low and the high concentrations. And so we can see that the Floyd and the Rock are quite a bit higher than the others. And again, when I look at the amount of nitrogen applied in these watersheds, that's on the left here. And so this is the amount of commercial plus the amount of manure nitrogen generated per corn hectare. And we can see in the Floyd and the Rock, much, much higher than the other 7, well over 300 kilogram per hectare. And so, that's quite a lot. The Iowa State recommendation would be about 180. And so we see these 2 watersheds where we have nitrogen inputs that are double the recommended amounts. And so lo and behold, those 2 watersheds also have the highest nitrate concentration. we have these two watersheds, the East Nishnabotna and the Nottoway, that have the lowest levels of inputs, and they also have the lowest nitrate concentrations. And so over the past several years, we've kind of gotten away from this idea that we need to manage inputs better. We've kind of thought that that's sort of futile to get farmers to do that, and so we focused on the edge of field treatment like wetlands and the bioreactors and some other things like cover crops. But I think this tells us that there's definitely some improvements to be had if we could somehow better manage our nitrogen inputs and reduce the amount that we're applying based on the crop needs. And so this is a nutrient strategy, and of course I work under that umbrella, and so I can't criticize it too much because this is the state's policy, right? This is the policy that I work under. But here we've say right here in the policy section of the nutrient strategy that our approach to addressing the diverse and weather-driven nutrient transport from Iowa non-point sources. Well, we know it's not weather-driven, right? We know that. Yes, the year-to-year variations are highly dependent on weather, but as the previous slide shown, the inputs of nitrogen to the ground, to the land, are still very important. And so this graph is what I call a scatter plot here, and this graph's a surplus of nitrogen in each of those watersheds versus the stream nitrate concentration. So the surplus is on the x-axis, the stream nitrates on the y-axis. The surplus is the commercial nitrogen plus the manure nitrogen plus the nitrogen that's fixed by soybeans, subtracting the amount of nitrogen harvested in the grain. And so we can see a very, very strong relationship between the stream nitrate and the surplus nitrogen in each of those watersheds. And so that R squared is 0.8. What that's telling us is the surplus explains 80% of the variation in the stream nitrate. And so I've done some nutrient budgeting here in the last couple of years. And so I know there's a lot going on in this graph, but the bars are the inputs. And so for the most part, the wide bars are the inputs. And so we can see there the commercial nitrogen is dark green, hog manure is orange, beef manure is red, dairy is the darker red, and then fixation from soybeans is the light green, and then poultry is the gray. And then the narrow yellow bars are the amount of nitrogen that's being removed in the grain. And so we can see the inputs statewide far exceed the amount removed in the grain, every year. And so that surplus is the red line. And then we know how much makes it into the stream, and that's the blue line. And so we know about 32% of that surplus is going to make it into Iowa streams. Excuse me. And so we really need to return to the idea of input management, in my estimation. We really need to look at that again and try to figure out some ways to better align the crop needs with the inputs. And so I'll focus here on the right-hand table, the percent change since 1999 for the nitrogen. The amount lost in our rivers has increased about 83%, but the amount that's increased from poultry manure, 76%, turkey 59, hogs 59, commercial 34, and so forth. You can see that. And so, this is what we would expect when we try to squeeze every last bit out of an ecosystem, right? And so we've increased total inputs there 36%, but we've only increased the amount of grain nitrogen that's removed 27%, but we've increased our pollution 83%. And so, you know, this is what we would expect out of an ecosystem. You know, we're pushing the pedal to the metal, and there's going to be diminishing returns. And so as long as we keep doing that, as long as we keep intensifying, you know, we're going to see a degradation of the streams. And so to kind of finish up here, we have what we call Huck 8 watersheds here in Iowa. Huck 8 is a hydrologic unit code. It's how we divide up watersheds by size. A Huck 8 is a certain size, and we have 56 Huck 8 watersheds in Iowa. So each one is on average about 1,000 square miles. And so half of our population lives in 8 of those watersheds. And so you can see where they are there. This Root River watershed way up here, mainly in Minnesota. 57 Iowans live in that one. That's our least number of people that live in a Huck 8. But when I calculate the manure generated by all our livestock and what the human equivalent is of that livestock combined with the people, this is how many people we have in our watersheds. And so, you know, the amount of fecal waste that we're generating here is equivalent to about 164 million people. And so how do we reconcile that with our water quality objectives? Can we do it? You know, can we continue to cram hogs into these watersheds and expect to get, you know, some acceptable water quality? Well, you know, we haven't done it so far. And so I would say we really have to ask ourselves, is this production model ever going to be consistent with the stream water quality that we want? And what do we have to do to get the water quality that we want? And so this was the Des Moines River this last summer in downtown Des Moines. You know, the Des Moines River is one of the drinking water sources for the city. And so we can see we had this huge algae bloom. And so, you know, this is what we're faced with going forward unless we can do something differently. And so what can we do? What can be done? Everybody asked me that. And so, you know, this is what I say the low-hanging fruit is. We can, you know, stop cropping in the 2-year floodplain. We have 400,000 acres in Iowa that are cropped in the 2-year floodplain. You know, why do we do that? It's crazy. Ban fall tillage. We know that fall tillage is a bad practice. We know it increases nutrient loss. We know it increases erosion, especially after a soybean crop. And so Iowa State has been putting out guidance on fall tillage since 1980. And so why do we still do it? It's crazy. We really need to ban manure on snow and frozen ground. And so, yes, we have some rules that were passed by the legislature, I think in 2009 or 2010. I think the Sierra Club worked on those rules, but they're weak and there's so many loopholes. We see manure applied to snow all the time. If there's snow on the ground on March 1st, you're going to see manure on top of it. And so we have that coming up here in about 3 weeks. I don't know where all you live, but where I live, there's no way this snow is going to be melted by March 1st. There's going to be people putting manure on it because the rule allows it. Make farmers adhere to the ISU fertilization guidelines. Iowa State publishes their N rate calculator on their website. We know that statewide farmers are probably anywhere from 2 to 50 pounds above that for nitrogen, to 20 to 50 pounds above that for nitrogen. What can we do to get farmers to adhere to those guidelines? And then I would say we need to reformulate these CAFO regulations. We really have no capacity to manage nutrients at the watershed scale. And so we have lots and lots of hogs crammed into some tight geographical areas, like we see with the Floyd and the Rock River in Northwest Iowa. It's probably not reasonable to think we can ever get good water quality up there with the density of hogs that we have. And so a lot of people know that, the master matrix rule is sort of outdated and we could stand to revisit it. And so I think we need to do that. And so this is my last slide, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Wow, thank you so much, Chris. That was just an incredible wealth of knowledge that you shared with us. And I just keep thinking about the one slide where you have kind of shown all the different populations that exist in Iowa when we look at nutrients. And it's just really astonishing to see, what we're doing to our land, our streams, our water. So thank you so much for that. We have a ton of questions. So lots of really good questions too. So I'm going to just kind of get going at these questions. And then I know that we said this will end at